In the quiet vaults beneath the Clinton Presidential Library, an old file was found, one that no one could explain. Its label was cryptic: Chapel. Inside were classified transcripts from a battlefield encounter between an American military chaplain and a Taliban warlord. What happened next defied military logic. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a prayer. And what Bill Clinton would discover, years after leaving the White House, would challenge his beliefs, his legacy, and the one question he thought he'd answered long ago: what happens when faith is stronger than war? It started with a leak. A retired archivist from the Clinton Presidential Library contacted Bill directly. No media, no emails, just an old-fashioned handwritten note delivered through back channels. "Sir, there's something here you need to see. Something that was never supposed to be here." At first, Bill Clinton didn't give it much thought. People sent him strange things all the time. But the phrasing, "never supposed to be here," stuck with him. So on a rainy Tuesday morning, he stepped into the basement of his own legacy. The air was colder than expected. Rows of cardboard boxes lined industrial shelves, each marked by decade, then crisis, then subject: Bosnia, Rwanda, impeachment, Y2K. Most files were familiar. This was his history, organized, packaged, archived. Except one wasn't. It sat alone on a table, unmarked except for a single word handwritten in thick black marker: Chapel. He opened it. Inside were yellowed reports stamped with both U.S. Department of Defense and CIA seals. The top page read: Unofficial Incident Report, Operation Seraphim, Kandahar, 2002. The body of the report was worse. A U.S. Army chaplain named Lieutenant John Wyatt had allegedly crossed enemy lines unarmed during an active combat standoff. His mission, according to his own handwritten statement, to pray with the enemy, to speak the language of surrender, not of weapons, but of spirit. Clinton reread the sentence 3 times. It didn't make sense. Not to him. Not to any administration. According to the document, Wyatt had walked into a Taliban-occupied village and requested an audience with a local commander, a known warlord responsible for dozens of American deaths. He wasn't detained. He wasn't executed. Instead, they let him pray. Not alone, together. With them. The warlord had, according to witness statements, fallen to his knees and whispered a line from the Quran: "There's no compulsion in religion. Truth stands clear from falsehood." And then, for reasons no one could explain, the fighting stopped. Clinton leaned back in the chair, staring at the words. The documents were raw, unpolished, never intended for political eyes. They spoke of an event that had been erased from all official records, buried because it defied logic, protocol, even doctrine. Chaplain Wyatt had disappeared shortly after. Transferred. Discharged. Gone. The file had no ending. Just a single note scribbled at the bottom of the last page. Faith resolved what policy never could. Clinton closed the folder. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt since the day he left the Oval Office. Uncertainty. He looked around the archive room, a room filled with facts, failures, victories, and wondered if this file, this story, this one impossible encounter, was the key to understanding everything he'd gotten wrong about faith, leadership, and what peace really looks like. But first, he had to find out if it was true. And to do that, he'd have to find the missing chaplain. Bill Clinton knew where to start, or at least where not to. Official records were a dead end. The name Chaplain John Wyatt appeared only 3 times in publicly available military databases, 2 chaplain rotations in Germany, and a brief mention during Operation Enduring Freedom in early 2002. No discharge record, no reassignment, no obituary. It was as if, after that one inexplicable act on the battlefield, the man had simply been erased. He called in a favor, an old CIA liaison who owed him more than one. Within 2 hours, he had a file. Slim. Redacted. The only lead was a location: Taos, New Mexico. A monastery. No name. Just a cryptic note. Possibly working under spiritual alias. Clinton booked a flight under a pseudonym and left the next morning without security detail. He hadn't done that in years. But something about this felt personal. Sacred, even. He needed to be alone. The monastery sat atop a plateau. nestled between cliffs and clouds. The air there tasted different, thinner, cleaner, the kind of silence that feels holy. Clinton introduced himself simply as William. The monks didn't ask questions. One of them, a weathered man with deep lines in his face and eyes that had seen war, nodded when Clinton asked about Wyatt. "He's not Wyatt anymore," the monk said. "He left that name at the gate. But you're not the first man to come looking for him." "Who was the last?" Clinton asked. "A woman," the monk replied. "Muslim. Came to forgive him for something he didn't do." Clinton froze. "What do you mean?" But the monk only gestured toward the chapel. Inside, candlelight flickered on ancient wood. And there, kneeling at the altar, was a man with a familiar bearing, broad-shouldered but humble in posture, hair grayer than the photos in the file. When he turned, Clinton saw a face that belonged in a battlefield, not a sanctuary. "I'm looking for John Wyatt," Clinton said. "You found what's left of him." The man replied softly. Clinton stepped forward. "I read the chapel file. I know what you did." "No," Wyatt said calmly. "You know what they wrote." Clinton sat beside him in the pew. "Did it happen?" Wyatt looked down at his hands, rough, calloused, not at peace. "Yes," he said finally, "but not the way they think. Not the way anyone thinks." Clinton didn't speak. Wyatt continued. "I didn't go to convert. I didn't go to preach. I went because I believed we'd all stopped listening. To each other. To God. And when I walked into that village, I didn't bring a message. I brought silence. I let him speak." "And he listened to you?" Clinton asked. "No," Wyatt said, smiling faintly. "But he listened to himself. And that was enough." Clinton leaned back, overwhelmed by the simplicity. And then the fighting stopped. Not forever. Just for that day. For that village. But it was enough to get the wounded out. Enough for mothers to bury their sons in peace. Clinton rubbed his temple. "Why did you vanish?" Wyatt looked up at the crucifix. "Because I'd done the one thing no one wanted me to do. I made peace without permission." The silence that followed was thick. "You buried it," Clinton said. "All of it." Wyatt nodded. "So others could live." But Clinton wasn't ready to leave it buried. Not anymore. This story could change everything people believe about faith and war. Wyatt shook his head. "No, it would only make them fight about it." Clinton stood. "Not if we tell it right." Wyatt looked at him, for the first time fully. "Then tell it as it happened," he said. "No heroes. No villains. Just two men, meeting in the ruins of their convictions, looking for God." Clinton returned to New York the next day. The chapel file tucked securely inside a briefcase he hadn't carried since his presidency. But his mind remained in that quiet chapel in New Mexico, replaying every word Wyatt had said, every silence he'd left behind. Something about the way Wyatt spoke had unsettled him. Not because he lied, but because he hadn't needed to. Truth didn't need defense when it lived in the cracks of things. Clinton sat alone in his office overlooking the East River, the folder open again in front of him. He'd seen classified intelligence, war memos, even assassination plots. But nothing haunted him like the image of a U.S. military chaplain kneeling beside a man responsible for American deaths and choosing to pray instead of retaliate. He thought about the headlines if the story ever went public. Ex-president reveals secret peace pact with Taliban. Religious fanatic or war hero. Fake news? Ex-chaplain's miracle under scrutiny. He needed help. Someone who could translate this story not just through politics, but through humanity. He called Rachel El-Sayed, his former policy advisor on religious diplomacy, now an interfaith journalist with a global following. Half Egyptian, half Southern Baptist, she understood both scripture and strategy. Within hours, she was on a flight to New York. Clinton met her at the heliport himself. "I'm guessing this isn't about fundraising," she said, her tone dry. He handed her the file, without a word. She read it on the rooftop under the buzz of the rotors, her expression slowly shifting from curiosity to disbelief. "Is this real?" she asked. "I met him," Clinton replied. "He's alive. He remembers everything." Rachel closed the folder. "Then why hasn't he come forward?" "He says the world wouldn't understand." Rachel nodded slowly. He's right. Clinton sat beside her on the bench. Then help me tell it anyway. She hesitated. You're not the only one looking into this. He turned sharply. What do you mean? Rachel pulled out her tablet. There's chatter. A woman named Navida Amin, the daughter of the Taliban commander Wyatt met. She's alive. A refugee in Istanbul. She's been speaking quietly to human rights groups. She calls Wyatt the man of peace. Says he saved her father's soul. Clinton leaned forward. Can you find her? Rachel smirked. She's already agreed to speak to me. She said she was waiting for someone to finally care. Clinton felt the weight of it all. A story too spiritual for the media, too human for politics. But maybe, just maybe, powerful enough to change something deeper. How we view enemies, and what peace can actually look like. Later that night, alone again, he pulled out one final page from the chapel file, one he hadn't shown Rachel yet. It was handwritten and signed, torn from a military notebook. God does not belong to any army. He waits outside the walls, in silence, until we put down our weapons and remember how to listen. Clinton stared at the words for a long time. He had made peace deals in his life, brokered ceasefires, signed papers that stopped bullets, at least temporarily. But none of it felt like this. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a war still happening inside people's souls. And it was time to tell the world. The story was ready to break. Clinton and Rachel had spent 2 sleepless weeks assembling it. Documents authenticated, dates verified, Navida's video interview recorded and translated. The centerpiece was the voice of Wyatt himself, recorded in that dim New Mexico chapel, describing his decision to pray with the enemy. But not everyone wanted it told. Rachel's secure server was breached. Twice. An anonymous email reached Clinton's personal account. Some wars were never meant to end. He forwarded it to a trusted cyber intelligence contact. Their reply came hours later. This came from inside. Someone with access to retired Pentagon servers. High-level clearance. Clinton stared at the screen, anger swelling behind his ribs. It was always like this. The truth was dangerous, not because it was false, but because it broke old stories. Meanwhile, Rachel boarded a flight to Istanbul to meet Navida Amin face-to-face. The footage would be the emotional anchor of their project. Navida lived modestly, in a small flat above a textile shop. She opened the door herself, a woman in her 40s with fierce eyes and a voice that held no fear. Your president has courage, she said simply. Not all men look back after leaving power. Rachel raised her camera. You knew Chaplain Wyatt? I saw him through a curtain, Navida replied. He did not come with soldiers. He came alone. My father, he was not a gentleman. He believed in jihad. But that day, something broke in him. Rachel leaned forward. What changed? Navida looked at her hands. No man had ever prayed with him before. Not even our own clerics. They feared him. But Wyatt, he sat on the ground. He listened. And when my father cried, he didn't speak. He just waited. He let God do the speaking. Rachel asked, and after that? He stopped fighting. He withdrew from the war. Our family fled. We lost everything. But I never forgot that moment. That peace didn't come from victory. It came from someone showing mercy first. Back in New York, Clinton met with a broadcast executive he trusted. You really want to air this? The executive asked. This will get attacked from all sides, the military, the church, the far right, the far left. You will be accused of everything from treason to fabrication. Clinton leaned in. It's the truest story I've ever held in my hands. The executive studied him. Then we'll air it. But you'd better be ready for the storm. The storm came early. The teaser trailer dropped online. A 30-second clip of Wyatt's voice saying, "We didn't win that day. We listened." That was enough. Within minutes, #ChapelFile was trending worldwide. Conspiracy theories bloomed like wildfire. Anonymous officials denied the event ever took place. Veterans groups were split. Some called Wyatt a traitor, others a prophet. And then came the call Clinton had been expecting. General Harris, the same man who'd buried the original chapel file 2 decades earlier. You're playing with fire, Bill. Harris growled over the phone. It's not fire, Clinton replied. It's light, and maybe it's time we stop being afraid of it. There was a pause. You go through with this. You'll destroy a lot of reputations, including your own. Clinton stared at the wall of photos in his office. World leaders, crises, handshakes, smiles. All the carefully curated images of power. And then he looked at the photo Rachel had printed from the archive. Wyatt kneeling in the dust, next to a warlord, both heads bowed in silence. He made his choice. The only reputation I care about now, he said, is the one I leave with God. And he hung up. The world wasn't ready for what was about to happen. When President Bill Clinton stepped into the lights of the packed auditorium, he wasn't a former head of state anymore. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a strategist. He was a man carrying a truth that had shaken his soul. Beside him stood Rachel El-Sayed, the interfaith journalist who'd chased this story across continents, and Navaida Amin, the daughter of a man once called an enemy of the United States. Most striking of all, Chaplain John Wyatt stood quietly in the background, the man who had once knelt in enemy territory and found something the military never trained him for: mercy. The screens lit up behind them. The teaser had gone viral. Millions had seen the 30-second clip of Wyatt saying softly, "We didn't win that day. We listened. That was enough." But now the full story would unfold, not with fire, but with silence, not with anger, but with understanding. Clinton approached the podium slowly. "What you're about to hear is not easy," he said. "It's not about victory. It's not about politics. It's about what happens when we stop fighting long enough to hear the voice of something greater than ourselves." The crowd hushed. Around the world, broadcasts streamed live. Translations echoed in dozens of languages. In churches, mosques, synagogues, refugee camps, and veteran centers, people leaned in to listen. Rachel began with Navaida's account. She described the moment a lone American entered her village, without arms. How he met her father, once a commander hardened by decades of war, and did not preach, nor threaten. "He didn't come to win," she said. "He came to sit. And my father cried." The footage followed. Chaplain Wyatt, older now, weathered and still, spoke simply. "I didn't know what I was doing that day. I just knew something had to break. And it wasn't going to be them. It had to be me." The crowd fell into reverent silence as he recalled sitting cross-legged in a dusty room beside a man who had lost sons to American bombs. "I sang a hymn I barely remembered from childhood." He didn't understand the words, but he closed his eyes and he breathed. For years, the chapel file had been buried. General Harris, now retired, had ordered the documentation classified, fearing what the world would do with a story that made enemies human. "We couldn't afford confusion," the general had written in a memo Clinton now read aloud. "Mercy complicates war." The revelation struck like a thunderclap. But Clinton didn't stop there. He spoke not just of Wyatt's act, but of its legacy. This story isn't about a ceasefire in a village no one remembers. It's about what we choose to do when given the chance to see one another without the armor of hate. Navaida stood beside him, her voice strong. "My father never returned to the fight. He died quietly, planting olive trees with his hands, and every tree he planted was rooted in that moment of silence." The story spread like wildfire, not a scandal but as inspiration. Pastors preached it. Imams quoted it. Journalists tried to dissect it, but something in the tale resisted dissection. It was not strategy. It was not manipulation. It was the rare, blinding truth that sometimes peace is possible, but only when someone kneels first. There was backlash, of course. Commentators screamed. Think tanks scrambled to spin. But the force of the story could not be undone. It was too honest, too raw, too painfully human. Clinton received threats. Wyatt's monastery was overrun by reporters. Rachel's devices were hacked. But none of it mattered. The real victory came days later, when Clinton and Rachel unveiled the Chapel of Hope Initiative, a global nonprofit devoted to deploying trained chaplains, clergy, and counselors into conflict zones, not to fight, not to proselytize, but to listen. "We're sending peace before paperwork," Clinton said, "mercy before mandate, and prayers before politics." In Kabul, A Christian pastor and a Muslim imam walked together into a community once shelled into silence. In South Sudan, a Jewish rabbi helped mediate between tribes. In a refugee camp outside Athens, Navida knelt beside a crying teenager and sang the same lullaby her father had once heard. At a private dinner that night, Clinton sat with Wyatt and Navida under a low sky scattered with stars. "Do you regret it?" he asked the chaplain. Wyatt smiled. "Only that it took me so long to see the enemy was never the man across from me. It was the fear in both our hearts." Clinton looked to the horizon, voice quieter than ever. "The longer I live, the more I believe that faith, true faith, is not what we claim. It's what we do when no one's watching. And what you did, that was faith." The story ended not with a resolution, but with a question. Could the world handle peace that didn't come with applause or treaties? Could we accept that the loudest prayers are the ones whispered in enemy territory? Clinton, in his final remarks to the media, said it plainly. This wasn't a publicity stunt. This wasn't about redemption or legacy. This was about one man showing us that mercy isn't weakness. It's the only real strength we have left. And if that doesn't change how we live, then maybe we've missed the point entirely. And with that, the file was unsealed. The chapel in the New Mexico desert was declared a historic site. Wyatt returned to his monastery. Rachel published a book called The Man Who Knelt. Navida founded an interfaith shelter in Istanbul. And somewhere, in the deep quiet of a conflict zone, a chaplain with no flag on his back but every language in his heart sat down across from a man with war in his eyes and waited. Not to speak, but to listen. Because now the world knew what could happen when someone decides to kneel first. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe and press the like button.